So I also want to acknowledge the land on which we meet, which is that of the Mississauga of Scugog Island. I also want to acknowledge Ann Taylor's presentation last night from Curve Lake First Nation. And Margaret, I really appreciate your intervention, and thank you very much for reminding us to always think back, but think back with an open heart and engage in these projects. So while this is the panel made up of a very eclectic group and ever-changing set of papers, and Andrea, thank you very much for stepping in literally at the last moment. I think that there may be connections between what Margaret and Emily presented in terms of research with community-based partners, and so thinking about relationships of trust, awesome. And it's not that one. It's okay. I'll see if it's relationships of. So that one isn't mine. But relationships of trust and openness when doing this type of collaborative work. So, so in that, this is a collaborative project that I'm talking about. We just published a piece about the project called Making Sense of Child Early and Forced Marriage Among Syrian Refugee Girls in Lebanon. That's just come out in the British Medical Journal of Global Health. It is a very collaborative project. I'm working with an epidemiologist, an emergency medicine doctor, a global health MA who's now at Mac in med school, and me. And so, I've done very interdisciplinary work before. This has been just a steep learning curve and a real privilege to learn. And we talked in our last panel about complexity, and the emergency medicine folks always sort of make fun of me and say, "Oh, Annie, it's so great that you're on this project. It's like you bring complexity." So it's like they want to just figure out interventions to assist with the rising rates of early age of marriage among Syrian refugees who have been displaced and are living in Lebanon, Jordan, or elsewhere. And I want to talk about what we mean when we talk about a child, or what we mean when we talk about marriage. And they're like, "Yeah, that's great, Annie." But in fact, there is somewhere in between, and I think, and I hope that bringing that socio-legal perspective to this interdisciplinary team does something. So I'm going to present really quickly the recently published work, and then what I want to do is talk about a new, cut through the data, and I'm trying to look at, again, I think this may connect with some of the other papers over the last 2 days, about that paradox of legal intervention. So we often turn to law as one of, although not the only, solution to a problem, such as rising rates of exploitation of young people, both men and women, in humanitarian settings, very complex, lots of actors on the ground. But when we turn to law, what does that do? And so I think that I want to talk about that in this particular example. So at the beginning, as I say, I'm going to use, as one of our earlier presenters talked about, the technology of research. So the first half is kind of about how a particular tool called Sensemaker was used to get information from a very large sample size. Again, I'm a qualitative person, I'm not a quantitative person. If you want to talk about R's and all of these things, I'll send you to Colleen Davison, who's our epidemiologist. And then the second half, I'm going to talk about this new work that I'm trying to think about in terms of the paradox of legal intervention in this case of early age of marriage in humanitarian settings. So prior research has already shown, so there's nothing new in the sense in knowing that lots of forms of gender-based violence increase in situations of displacement, or when communities are moved by reason of natural disaster or economic distress or armed conflict. So we have original or existing research in that area. The organization with whom we're partnered in Lebanon is called Abad for Gender Equality, and Abad's own work had identified this problem when working with communities of Syrian refugees in the country. Abad then asked this interdisciplinary team if we might look at this more carefully and more closely in order to then, like Margaret and Emily, use that research to think about better interventions with Abad. So the aim was then to, obviously, and this is right out of the research grant, to think about implementation strategies that might have the end goal of reducing rates of child marriage amongst Syrian refugees. And we use this tool. Unfortunately, it is not an open source tool called Sensemaker. I'm going to walk you through what Sensemaker offers us in terms of empirical research. So we wanted to look more carefully, because even though there's existing research in this area, there's actually not that much qualitative research looking in humanitarian settings. So we tend to extrapolate the research on early age at marriage in other settings and extrapolate from that to humanitarian settings or situations of mass displacement. And to a large extent, our findings confirmed that those factors are similar. We were interested in which factors are different. So Sensemaker, as I say, is a bit expensive, but it's very, if you write it into your SSHRC grant, you can, actually this is not funded by SSHRC, this is funded by the World Bank Group Sexual Violence Initiative, and so it was a 12-month project. So the funding was for 12 months, and then you have the data and you can work on it, obviously, for a longer time. So we built that into our grant application, and Sensemaker is tablet-based, and it allows you to collect a lot of information anonymously in a very short period of time. And the innovation, I think, and some of my graduate students are tired of me talking about this, but the innovation that I take away from this tool is that two innovations. One is you're asking participants to narrate a story without actually naming the issue on which you may be doing your research. So in our case, actually, the prompting stories, we asked, tell us a story about what it's like for you or for someone in your family for Syrian girls in Lebanon. That's it. It was that open-ended. Tell us a story. As a qualitative researcher, I'm freaking out, because I'm actually interested in this problem of early age at marriage and interventions and so on. What do you mean we're not going to ask them anything about marriage, education, violence, nothing? Tell us a story. Or a second prompt was, your cousin calls you and asks you what the biggest difference is for Syrian girls living in Lebanon as opposed to at home. Again, totally open-ended. So I think that's very, very interesting, and you have to kind of just be open to what stories they are telling. Secondly, is you ask your research participants to analyze their own stories. So it is a self-analyzed tool. So you ask them, ask them multiple choice questions, some triads, dyads, and stones. What are triads, dyads, and stones? This is what a triad looked like in our survey. So you say, the person tells a story. It can be about themselves. It can be about somebody else. It can be be about their neighbor. And it is completely anonymous. You take no one's name. No phone numbers, no nothing. They click their informed consent at the beginning, and that's it. Of course, that means from a qualitative perspective, you can't go back to them to ask for clarification, but nonetheless. So that you say the story you shared relates mostly to education, protection, or the financial situation. And you have to constantly, the interviewers will remind the participants that it's not about X problem or Y problem, it's about the story that you told. So they are analyzing their own narratives. The 4-minute story is 4 to 5 minutes on average, is recorded on the tablet and then uploaded each night to a cloud. The advantage here is that rather than a scale, they can put it smack dab in the middle. They move the stone to they move the marker to wherever they want it. So people can say it's all about protection and security, it's all about education, or actually it's about all three. Or it's, if you wanted to say that it's related to education and finance, you'll put it in the middle in between. That's a triad. So we had a number of triad questions. We had dyad questions. These were the hardest for us to design. You say, from your perspective, the Syrian girl in your story is or are protected too much or not protected enough. They're meant to be equal values, so it's not meant to be a good on one end and a bad on the other end. It's meant to be equal value, so that again, there's not a way in which you are oriented towards one or oriented to the other. This was very hard, again, to construct questions like this, because you normally we tend to think about and ask our research questions in a way that is a little bit more categorical and negative to positive. That's the way we think of a scale. And so that's one question. In terms of the translation, it was originally written with Abad and others, but we did draft it first in English. It was then translated into Arabic and back translated into English to check for accuracy. Arabic is a very nuanced and rich language, and so sometimes words we had to go back and forth. So the translation and back translation was an important part of the process. The hardest for participants are these stones. So the stones are, you have two axes and you have a number of different stones that you can place between the axes. And again, I think the easier one is, and I'll show it to you later, is an importance scale on both. So there's another stone that we use where it's the relative importance to something to parents is along the bottom, and the relative importance to the girl in your story is here. And so then you had to put the stone, education for example, along those scales. This was actually quite difficult for the participants, and we have since changed it in a subsequent project because the advantage of Sensemaker is it's supposed to be good for people who have less formal education, so it's very good for working with refugee populations who may have been displaced for a number of years. It's meant to be visual and all that, but actually we find that this is a fairly complex part of the survey. So we conducted interviews in Tripoli, Beirut, and Baqaa in July and August, and again with Abad as the implementing partner. And it's a very short period of time. As you can see, it was first piloted in January or February 2016. Then there was training in the spring, and then the data collection occurred July and August. We targeted 6 cohorts, including, and we did get ethics approval to be interviewing men and women as young teenagers as young as 13. We interviewed Syrian mothers, Syrian fathers, Lebanese men who were either married to Syrians or unmarried but were thinking about marrying Syrian women. And community leaders, although community leaders were the smallest in our cohort. So we actually collected 1,422 narratives. Again, as a qualitative researcher, this is numbers I'm not used to seeing. From 1,346 unique participants. Why are there more stories than participants? That's because you invite someone at the end of the interview, do you want to tell us another story? And some chose to tell another story, and then they analyzed it again. That's quite a time commitment. It does take 20 to 30 minutes, but in 7 weeks to collect narratives. Now, again, from a qualitative perspective, those narratives are really snapshots. Like people tell a story, right? So it's not the type of research that we might be accustomed to. But it is a large volume of qualitative and quantitative. We pulled from those narratives the 40% of the stories that either mentioned child marriage or were about early marriage. So so even without a story prompt, 40% of the narratives concerned early age of marriage. So I had to concede that actually it seems to have worked. But actually, more to the point, if it hadn't, then that's a finding as well, right? So what we found was that this was clearly an issue of concern, as Abad had already identified in the communities that were sampled. So some of the ways in which we analyze this data is also super interesting. I don't know if people have worked with Tableau. So Tableau is actually an open source program that you can use to analyze your data from Excel or anything else. You can import it. And here you're able to visually represent and then quantitatively analyze what are statistically significant differences between cohort responses. And this allowed us to quickly visually represent differences between Tripoli and Beirut, for example, or the Baqaa Valley and Beirut, between the informal tented settlements and the city, or between men and women. And our most important finding, in the whole project is that while it seems to be that the people's emotional tone in terms of their stories about early age at marriage amongst Syrians in Lebanon, everyone seemed equally concerned. Most described it as a negative coping mechanism for communities who are displaced and living in Lebanon. But the explanation for why it happened, so the motivating factor, was gendered. So men and women tended to explain it differently on these triads. And again, I didn't do the tableau analysis, and you can't quite see it, but if you looked up close, I'm happy to share the slides, you can see that these are statistically different responses for cohorts. Oh. So that was how you analyze that. And then you break it out. You have other triangles. You can see them all by each cohort. On the dyads, it's a little bit easier, obviously, to visually represent on histograms. And again, we look at statistical differences between groups. And again, this question about protection was really interesting because, again, another important finding in the research was that some Syrian girls considered that they were protected too much. So we wanted to explore, like, why would they feel they're protected too much? Why? Because rather than being a negative coping mechanism, for some Syrian teenagers, in particular female teenagers, they actually thought that their parents and communities were overly protective, right? And so it was actually infringing on their autonomy and their ability to get out of the house. And they were regulated in extreme ways because of sexual harassment by the Lebanese and by others. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the stones, as I say, ends up being visually represented like this. And again, you can cluster it in all sorts of ways. And when I talk about the rights of girls, I'll show you a different thing. So I was not involved in the actual data collection, but a year ago this time we went back to Lebanon and and did focus groups in each of the 3 locations where the data was collected, and worked with Abad to think about interventions. So this was obviously this is more in my wheelhouse. This is where I'm happiest in focus groups and interviews. And so we did focus groups in all of the locations, and we chose a couple of the visual representations and said, oh, this is what we're seeing. What do you see? This is what we're thinking about. What are you thinking about? So, so here we're just sharing one of the triads, and this led to some really interesting conversations. And again, there was only one occasion in a focus group with men where he said, oh, I actually did the survey. And so we were joking about, like, do you think you're this dot or that dot? Like, there are like thousands of dots on these things. But we pulled it out. So the idea was not to go back to the original people. Obviously, we didn't know who had participated, but sometimes people will reveal that they did. So what does this have to do with law? So one of the things that's interesting is that in the literature generally, and in a lot of the policy literature, you see this reliance on law as a solution to a problem of early age at marriage, both in situations of humanitarian crisis, but more generally in terms of trying to address early age at marriage, educate girls being pulled out of school and so on. And that sort of suite of legal responses includes trying to have marriage age laws put in place and implemented, birth registration, marriage registration, that's in our UN documents, and indeed rights at separation and divorce, and legal literacy campaigns, education, and prevention. So we wanted to talk about that in the focus groups. Marriage age laws, like in Canada, are incredibly complex due to legal pluralism. As here in Lebanon, you have religious and customary legal systems, governing marriage and overlapping with the Lebanese statutory law. One of the things that the literature has found is that as challenging as trying to implement marriage laws is actually having adequate birth registration in place. And a lot of previous, not a lot, but some previous research has shown that where birth registration is low, it correlates with a low age at first marriage. And so one of the strategies then is to put in place birth registration along with marriage registration. And it's interesting, and I can talk about it later, but there's also been some research in Ethiopia and elsewhere that shows that even this, like the act of registering has an impact on people's sense of self, right? So any of us who read David Engel or others in legal consciousness, where this is a much more subtle way in which law and legal implementation has an impact on subjectivity and sense of self. But here I'm focusing on a much less interesting, or at least less theoretical dimension. So what's the problem, however, okay, so here's a visual representation. You can't see it very well, but this is the pictorial representation of where there is a very low registration of birth, and it correlates with the early age at first marriage. They found this in Jordan as well, but here's the problem, is that, in many, many places, the birth registration is just not working. And for many who are refugees and displaced, they have particular problems in registering both births, deaths, marriages, and so on. And in Lebanon, it's even worse, because in May 2015, on the directive of the Lebanese government, the UNHCR, the refugee agency, stopped registering refugees in May 2015. So you actually have, and we talked to a mother whose child is undocumented, the child legally does not exist, has not been registered by either the UNHCR, there's no birth certificate, and therefore would never be a death certificate. There are other ways in which it's complicated in the Lebanese context, because there's a lot of harassment at checkpoints. So if you don't have documents, this leads for men in particular on real constraints on their mobility, their ability to work, for the children to be registered, and protections at marriage and divorce. So if you actually don't have a properly registered marriage, then you can't actually enforce your rights at separation. We heard a lot in focus groups about the lack of adequate religious community leaders, and so they're not necessarily recognized as official. These, even if they do get married kind of pseudo-officially, the sheikhs that are working are available amongst the Lebanese families are not seen as legitimate. So this is weird, but because you can't see the dots, I'm not quite sure I can see it on mine, but you can't see it on yours. So all this by way of saying that a number of fathers in the focus groups commented that because of the high levels of harassment by Lebanese men towards their daughters, that they actually would prefer to marry them off early as a protection mechanism than allow them to be sexually assaulted by the Lebanese. And so again, it's seen as a protection from sexual harassment. What about the law? Well, they actually said that if we actually married the girls and they would have rights at separation and divorce, we're more likely to marry them earlier. So that, I was like, my head was spinning. So that's where I'm at now, trying to figure out whether it was said by more than one interlocutor, but I'm trying to figure out this paradox of legal intervention where it's clear that we need to have holistic solutions, as was talked about before, but what is the role of law in that set of holistic interventions to try and deal with these problems? Because it seems to me we came away with it that the greater problem is actually the violence from the Lebanese community towards the Syrian refugee population, and certainly the other big takeaway is that you absolutely need to be engaging men and boys in the strategies, because so many of the perceptions of what the problems are and what the interventions might be differ, whether we're talking to young men, fathers, or community leaders, or to mothers and daughters. So as I say, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm happy to send you the article, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.